Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 21st lecture in our course on brain and behavior. And in this unit, we'll talk about hormones and sexual behavior. So we've spent a lot of time already talking about how neurons communicate with one another, and some time on things like the senses, how the brain detects what's going on in the environment around us. But we haven't talked very much about how the brain communicates with other parts of the body. So that's what we'll do here. We'll talk about hormones, what hormones are, and we'll use a specific example of sexual behavior as an indicator of how this sort of works, how we have both our neural communication and hormonal communication, and what impact that has on what we do in the world. So we'll talk about the endocrine system. This is going to be a very broad overview. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about anatomy, certainly not going to go into an exhaustive list of hormones, but the idea is to first know what hormones are, define them, we'll look at how hormones differ from neurotransmitters, and we'll see how the endocrine system, that is, the system of the body that deals with hormones, how it interacts with the nervous system. And there are some points of contact. There's one major point of contact that we'll focus on called the hypothalamus. And we'll see that the endocrine system is activated by the nervous system, but it also has an impact on the nervous system. It's sort of a two-way street. So we'll talk about how that works. We'll do a little bit of anatomy, talk about some of the parts of the body that secrete hormones. Again, not an exhaustive list, but a lot of this is probably unfamiliar to you. We've been talking about the nervous system for quite a while. We know the parts of the nervous system and the brain in particular. But we haven't really talked much about other parts of the body. So we'll talk about a couple body parts. And we'll also see how these endocrine organs and the brain work together to have some impact on behavior. A hormone might predispose one to actions one might not otherwise take, especially when it comes to our example of sexual behavior. Many animals, mammals in particular, sexual behavior can be triggered by secretion of hormones. And so it can have a very big impact on behavior. For humans, our sophisticated cognition allows us a little more control over our behavior, but still, we have behaviors that are influenced by hormones. And certainly the development of the body is influenced by hormones. So we'll link the brain and endocrine systems. We'll see how these two interact, how they signal each other, how the brain can cause the release of hormones, but how hormones can also impact activity in the brain. And we've again been talking about neural signaling for quite a while now, and we'll contrast and compare neurotransmitters with hormones. So both kinds of chemicals are involved in signaling. They send signals to other cells. Those signals are picked up. The question really between hormones and neurotransmitters is how broad a signal do these chemicals send, and how quickly do they have their effects. And we'll see how the nervous system can trigger hormone release, but that's not usually the end of the story, that these various organs in the body create their own hormones, and they might be triggered by chemicals released by the brain, but the body itself also controls hormone levels and has an impact on the brain. So there's what we call a feedback loop. There's a means of regulating hormone levels. And once we get familiar with what hormones are, how they're secreted, how their levels are regulated, we'll see a concrete example in the case of sexual development, sex hormones, and sexual behavior. So I'll give a broad overview of the endocrine system. And what defines the endocrine system is the use of hormones. So the nervous system uses neurons and neurotransmitters. The endocrine system uses hormones to signal different parts of the body. And hormone is not a chemical designation. As we're about to see, there are a number of different chemical structures that a hormone can take. So this is not a description of its chemistry. This is a description of its function. So what hormones do is they are secreted into the bloodstream, they circulate around the body, and they can have a number of effects on different tissues in the body. So they are a very sort of broad signal that the body can send. And they're secreted by what are called endocrine glands. Endo, we've seen that prefix before, means inside or within. And this is in contrast to exocrine glands, which secrete things like sweat or the oil on your skin, because those are secreted out of the body. Endocrine glands secrete things within the body. And as I just said, there are a wide range of things that hormones do. They affect a lot of different tissues. They have a lot of different effects in terms of what they make those tissues do. Sometimes all they do is make that tissue release another hormone of its own. We're going to see a chain of hormone release in this unit. And we're going to focus on sex and sexual behavior as an example, but they're involved in a number of processes. For example, this is related to sexual behavior, but this is not actual mating behavior. This is competition between two males during mating season. And so hormones have a big role in causing this behavior. This behavior does not really occur outside of mating season. But because of a change in hormone levels, males will compete for territory or potential mates when these hormone levels change. Parenting behavior, both in males and females. There's a famous experiment. We don't have time to look at it in this unit, so I'll just mention it here. But they took a rat who was a new mother, had just given birth to pups that we see here, and they took chemicals from the blood of this rat and put them into a female rat that had not given birth. And just whatever was in the bloodstream caused that non-mother rat to exhibit parenting behavior to these pups. And so obviously humans are more complex than this. Our behavior might be altered by hormones, but we wouldn't exhibit a behavior like that just because of hormone changes. But we see this in lots of mammals, that hormones have a huge effect on behavior. That slow processes like growth, human growth hormone you may have heard of, HGH. So this literally affects how you grow and your overall adult development. Chemicals like melatonin are hormones. And so they affect sleep cycle. So here we see a dog sleeping, but humans use melatonin also. And so this affects your daily cycle. So we have everything from your entire lifetime for growth, to seasonal behaviors, like mating season, to day and night cycles, like melatonin, using melatonin, and even shorter term behaviors, like eating behavior. Whether we feel full or hungry is a function of hormone levels. It affects our digestion, it affects our blood sugar levels. So hormones are involved in a number of processes that we're not going to get to talk about. But just so you're aware, there are a wide range of behaviors and physiological functions that hormones are involved in. So here we see a big table from your book. And these are the major endocrine glands. We are not going to focus on all of these. Again, we don't have time. But we're going to see a couple of these come up again and again. So one is the hypothalamus. So we already know that the thalamus is part of the brain toward the middle. The word hypo means under. So this is literally a part of the brain that's under the thalamus. And this is sort of the master gland of the endocrine system. And it certainly is the most important bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And what we're going to see is that the hypothalamus secretes hormones itself, but also sends chemical signals that are also hormones to a very short distance to the pituitary gland. So some of the things the hypothalamus does are long distance, hormones that circulate around the entire body. Some have an impact very close by in the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland releases its own hormones. So this is one of these chains we're going to see. The pituitary gland can release hormones that affect the gonads, the testes and ovaries in men and women respectively. So these are the sex organs. Sex organs, of course, release their own hormones. So we see a chain of cause and effect. Hormone A causes the release of hormone B, causes the release of hormone C. And so we see this chain occurring in multiple parts of the endocrine system. Again, we're going to focus on sex organs and sexual behavior. But these are, again, broad signals that are released by these glands and have an impact on potentially very distant parts of the body. First, a little bit of history. So this is a scientist named Arnold Berthold, and he was the first one to really look at hormones in the endocrine system scientifically. So it had been known for centuries, especially to farmers and ranchers, that if you removed the testes of an animal, that it developed differently, that it behaved differently. If you remove the testes of a bull, for example, obviously it affects its reproductive capacity, but it affects its behavior and its body development as well. So this was known. And Berthold looked at roosters to really understand what hormones were. He didn't know, no one really knew how this process worked, how the sex organs affected development and behavior. And so Berthold asked what seems to us now a very simple question. How do the sex organs affect development and behavior? There are a couple possibilities. One is the sex organs are connected to the nervous system, and that they in some way control behavior. They might send neural signals that cause certain behaviors. They might send neural signals that cause development in certain ways. It was unclear until the 1800s how this worked, and then no one had really asked it the way that Berthold did. So it was known that normally roosters develop into larger animals. So rooster development, if the testes are intact, roosters can get pretty big. And they will engage in sexual behavior. They will try to copulate with females. They will engage in aggressive behaviors with other males. They will exhibit characteristic vocalizations, the cock-a-doodle-doo that we all know. And this is what happens if you leave a rooster alone. This was already known. It had been known for millennia. What was interesting, though, and what Berthold did, was first he removed the testes of a rooster. And again, people knew what happened when you remove the testes. Normally, if you remove the testes of a rooster, it develops differently. It doesn't get as big. It doesn't engage in aggressive or sexual behaviors. Its vocalizations are diminished. So again, this was not a surprise. This was not Berthold's contribution. What Berthold did was a clever experiment. So he removed the testes of the rooster, but then he reimplanted them in the body cavity of the rooster, not where the testes normally are. And so by removing them first, Berthold disconnected the testes from the nervous system. And then he waited to see what would happen. So the testes are in the body cavity, they're supplied with blood, but they're no longer connected to the nervous system. And as it turns out, these roosters developed normally. They attained their usual size. They had the characteristic comb and wattle, the red parts that are on a rooster's head, engaged in sexual behavior, engaged in aggressive behavior against other males, and had normal vocalizations. So this was interesting. The testes had been removed and then put back in the body, but not in the normal location. Their connection to the nervous system had been severed. What did this mean? Well, it meant that whatever the testes were doing, and this is extrapolated to the sex organs in general, it's non-neural in nature. So the testes do not send neural signals to the brain that causes sexual behavior or aggressive behavior. And yet there's clearly some sort of signal involved, because if you remove the testes entirely, development is very different. But everything turned out normally for the roosters that had had the testes reimplanted. So somehow, connecting the testes to the blood supply but not the nervous system was sufficient. Well, that meant there was some sort of chemical going into the blood, as it turns out testosterone, that the testes were releasing that was being picked up by the rest of the body. So that was the first real big indication that sex organs and other endocrine organs are releasing chemicals but are not using the nervous system to alter behavior or to alter development. So these are chemical signals, and we've seen different kinds of chemical signaling. We've seen synaptic communication, synaptic transmission, releasing a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter is picked up by the postsynaptic neuron. It has receptors for that neurotransmitter. We've seen this a lot. We're not going to go back into the details here. But this is different from endocrine communication, where a chemical is released into the blood supply, so it diffuses into the blood vessel, and then it diffuses out again and binds to receptors, so that's something it has in common with neurotransmitters. But those receptors could be on the other end of the body because blood obviously circulates throughout the body. So these are, again, sort of large broadcast signals. They are not as specific as synaptic communication. So that's endocrine communication, released into the blood supply and able to reach vast numbers of target cells. It doesn't stop there, though. Some animals will release pheromones, and we've talked about pheromones briefly in our unit on the senses. Pheromones are chemicals that the body releases, not to signal other organs in the body, but to signal other members of the species. So we see here a diagram of a wolf sniffing a tree. That is not the tree releasing the chemicals. This is a tree that has been marked by urine of another wolf, and so the wolf can pick up this signal, realize that that territory belongs to another wolf, and either leave the territory or perhaps engage in aggressive behavior against that territory's owner. But in either case, those pheromones are going to affect the behavior of the wolf doing the sniffing here. So one wolf releases the chemicals, another wolf picks them up, and it affects that wolf's behavior. So communication between members of a species. You can also have what are called allomones. And these are chemicals released by one species that affect the behavior of another. So this is a diagram from your book. Here we see a bee going into a flower. So the flower has released a chemical, a scent, that the bee can pick up. And it affects the bee's behavior. The bee will go toward the flower. Now, this helps the bee get some food, but it also helps the flower pollinate other members of its own species. But that chemical is secreted in order not to affect other flowers, but to affect bees, different species. This is a picture of the bolus spider. The bolus spider secretes chemicals that are also secreted by certain species of moth. And it turns out that they're secreted usually by the female of the species. And so moths will be attracted to this chemical and thinking, to the extent a moth thinks, that a female must be nearby, they will go toward the bolus spider. And the bolus spider, as you can see, has this sort of sticky little blob on the end of a piece of silk, and it throws this blob at the moth and catches it. And so that's how the bolus spider gets its prey. It uses allomones. It secretes chemicals that members of another species will be attracted to. So those are just some examples of sort of the scales of communication that chemicals can be used for. We've seen synaptic communication so far. Today we'll talk about endocrine communication. So structurally, there are different kinds of hormones. There are protein, otherwise known as peptide hormones. And in this diagram from your book, each oval represents a different amino acid. So these are very large chemicals. We're talking about hundreds, thousands of atoms. And so these are very large. But there are also simpler hormones that are made out of just one amino acid. And here we're talking about much smaller numbers of atoms, but they are both hormones. So again, hormone is not a chemical designation. There are also steroid hormones, and you've probably heard of steroids, certainly in terms like anabolic steroids used for bodybuilding. But steroids, the word steroid is a chemical designation. So hormone describes what the chemical does. The word steroid describes how it's made. So steroid hormones are derived from the molecule cholesterol, which you've probably heard of, and chemicals like estrogen. Technically, what you might think that estrogen is a single chemical. You talk about the body releasing estrogen or someone having high estrogen levels. Estrogen is actually a group of hormones. We're not going to belabor that distinction much. The main estrogen is called estradiol, which we see here. Testosterone is another steroid hormone. And we'll talk about why this chemical difference is important here in a minute. But this is just to reinforce the idea that hormones can have lots of different shapes and sizes. So how do these work? Well, it depends on what kind of hormone you're talking about. For protein and amine hormones, you will have receptors that are lodged in the membrane of a cell, and because we're talking about the endocrine system, these do not have to be neurons. They can be, but lots of tissues in the body will have receptors for hormones. And here, this works a lot like neural communication. You have a receptor in the membrane. A hormone comes along, binds to the receptor changes its shape, and releases what are called second messengers. So here the idea is that the hormone itself, the chemical outside the cell, is the first messenger. But then the receptor will activate these second messenger molecules. There are some common examples. We're not going to go into them. But these are chemicals that go around inside the cell and have some impact on its function. Change its metabolism, change which genes are being transcribed, change which receptors are active. And so this is how protein and amine hormones work, because they can't cross the cell membrane. They have to stay outside. And so they will bind to a receptor. That receptor will impact the internal processes of the cell. Steroid hormones, as I mentioned, they are made from cholesterol. And steroid hormones can go right through the membrane. They don't need receptors outside. They don't need to be receptors embedded in the cell membrane because the steroid hormones can go right through. That wall might as well not be there. One of the main ways that steroid hormones have their effect is by going into the cell nucleus. And they have what's called a genomic effect. They actually alter which DNA is being used to create proteins. This is a very long-term process, and this is why steroid hormones affect things like sexual development. Puberty takes years. We're talking about very long processes. Genes being transcribed, proteins being made, waiting for cells in the body to develop. This takes a long time, and sort of like the distinction between ionotropic and metabotropic receptors, we have a distinction between different time scales on which hormones can work. At the beginning we saw that being hungry or being full, that's mediated by hormones. And while that is longer than neural signaling, it might take minutes. It's still much quicker than the process of overall body growth or sexual development. So a wide range of time scales, but steroid hormones tend to go inside the nuclei of cells and affect long-term processes. There are some non-genomic effects that steroids can have. We're not going to worry about them, but they can have a wide range of effects. Specifically, let's look at some glands. So some important glands. One of them is the pituitary gland, which you may have heard of. The pituitary gland is about the size of a pea. It's very small, but it's very important. And it actually has two halves. One half is called the anterior pituitary. Anterior, if we remember our unit on anatomy, means forward. So this is the half of the pituitary gland that's toward the face. And we'll get to this in a minute. The anterior pituitary is actually sort of the more complicated of the two parts of the pituitary gland. And despite it looking like one organ, the pituitary gland is actually composed of two very different kinds of tissue. The anterior pituitary derives from non-neural tissue. The posterior pituitary, that we see highlighted here now, derives from the brain. And so as the head develops, these two different kinds of tissue will sort of form this little ball that is the pituitary gland. But they are made of two very different kinds of tissue. But the pituitary gland in general is important for secreting, controlling hormones. And in the case of the posterior pituitary, there are cells called neuroendocrine cells. And these look a lot like neurons. They have a cell body. In fact, the cell bodies of these neuroendocrine cells in the posterior pituitary, those cell bodies actually live in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends axons down to the posterior pituitary. And so the posterior pituitary, that is the half of the pituitary gland toward the back of the head, is actually just what would be the axon terminals of these neuroendocrine cells. So the axon terminals connect to the bloodstream, they connect to blood vessels. And so really all the posterior pituitary is the collection of terminals from these neuroendocrine cells that live, cell bodies live in the hypothalamus. And so these cells, these neuroendocrine cells, represent sort of a bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system. They have cell bodies, they have receptors that respond to neurotransmitters, so they form synapses. And they send action potentials. But on the axon terminal end, Instead of sending neurotransmitters to the next neuron, they release hormones into the bloodstream. So their sort of front half is like a neuron, and their lower half is like an endocrine cell. So they are neuroendocrine cells. And those hormones can, again, go into the bloodstream and affect very distant parts of the body. And so it's important to understand that how these things are a bridge and how they sort of form not just functionally a bridge, but also structurally they represent this sort of in-between kind of cell. So they do use action potentials just like a neuron does. We've talked about action potentials before. We have the influx of sodium, the efflux, the outgoing ions of potassium. It gets to the axon terminals, and we have vesicle fusion. And again, the difference is that it releases hormones instead of neurotransmitters. So hormone release is what the neuroendocrine cells do, but their input, what triggers them, is neurotransmitters because they connect to neurons and are waiting for neural signals. And the posterior pituitary releases mainly two hormones. And these are called oxytocin and vasopressin. And these are very important for reproductive behaviors, for parenting behavior, but also for social behavior in general, as we're about to see. So a little more detail on what these two hormones do. They're involved in reproduction and parental behavior. During childbirth, oxytocin induces uterine contractions, the labor process. So the uterus has a lot of muscle tissue around the outside, and when it is time to give birth, the uterus will start to contract, and that allows the infant to exit the birth canal. And so uterine contractions are brought on by the release of oxytocin. And if labor is not proceeding fast enough, a doctor can often use synthetic oxytocin to help that process along. It's also involved in nursing behavior. There's what's called the milk letdown reflex. And here we see a very simple kind of feedback loop. So in this case, the infant attempts to nurse, puts pressure on the skin of the breast, and that is a sensory signal. We've already talked about the somatosensory system. So there are pressure-sensitive cells in the breast, just as there are in other parts of the skin, and that signal is sent to the brain. But the fact that it is particular to nursing behavior means that signals are sent to the hypothalamus and down to the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then circulates around the bloodstream, and when it gets to tissue in the breast, it causes milk to be released. So this is that sort of loop that allows an infant to nurse. So the infant generates a sensory input for the mother. The mother's brain interprets that sensory input, causes the release of a hormone, and then releases milk. So that is, we get from a sensory signal to a hormonal signal to a behavior. And oxytocin and vasopressin are also involved in social behavior. So vasopressin in particular seems to be involved in forming relationships, what we call pair bonding. So these adorable little creatures here are called prairie voles. And prairie voles form monogamous relationships. They have close cousins called meadow voles that don't. And so there's an important difference between prairie voles and meadow voles, despite the fact that they are genetically and certainly in terms of their shape and appearance, they are very, very similar. And yet the prairie voles form monogamous pairs and the meadow voles do not. But if you look at the anatomy is not important. If you look at how many vasopressin receptors these voles have, the meadow voles that don't form monogamous relationships have some, but not a lot. The prairie voles that form these monogamous relationships have an enormous number of vasopressin receptors. So that seems to be at least partially the basis for these monogamous relationships, this very different social structure, forming these social bonds. It seems to depend on vasopressin. There's actually evidence in humans, not that humans exhibit just one kind of relationship that depends on vasopressin or not having vasopressin, but it turns out that things like relationship quality may actually depend on the kind of vasopressin receptors you have. Things like strife in a relationship and fidelity rates seem to be related to the type of vasopressin receptors a person has. Other social behaviors as well. Oxytocin is often described as sort of the feel-good hormone, not in the sense that dopamine is, that it literally means pleasure. Again, that is a simplistic view of dopamine. But in terms of seeking out social contact and physical contact. There was a famous study show that we see a figure from here, looking at complex social behavior like trust in humans. What this graph is showing you is how much money people trusted others with. They were playing a trust game. And so what they measured was how much money did you send to another person if you knew that if they wanted to, they could just walk away with it. Whatever you sent would grow, would earn a return. And then that other person could either split it with you, sort of pay back your trust, or could walk away with it. And people were far more trusting after they'd gotten just a little squirt of oxytocin. So you give people oxytocin, they become more pro-social. They will seek out contact more, they will depend on others more, they will trust other people more. And these are complex behaviors. And we're no longer talking about little rodents like prairie voles, we're talking about people. And so oxytocin and vasopressin seem to have a role, an important one, in human social behavior as well, even if that behavior is not sort of as automatic, even if it's a more complex behavior. Okay, that's the posterior pituitary. We're going to move on to the anterior pituitary, which we'll focus on for the rest of this unit. And the anterior pituitary, again, is not a part of the pituitary gland that derives from neural tissue. It derives from what's called the ectoderm. We're not going to deal with the details. But it just happens to be next to this neurally derived tissue. But it secretes a lot of different hormones, as we see in the list at the bottom of this figure from your book. It is still controlled by the hypothalamus, though, just a little bit different. So here we have the anterior pituitary, and this mixture of colors is meant to indicate the different cells that release different hormones. We're not going to go through all of them, but what these cells do is release what are called tropic hormones. It looks like tropic, it's pronounced tropic. And so these are the chemicals that go into the blood supply and circulate around the rest of the body and have an impact on different organs in the body. So the anterior pituitary is very important. Disorders of the anterior pituitary can be very disruptive to the body. But again, it's controlled by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus has neuroendocrine cells where the terminals don't go all the way into the anterior pituitary. Instead, they connect to blood vessels that then go into the anterior pituitary. So you can't just have the hypothalamus releasing the hormones, releasing the tropic hormones. They secrete what are called releasing hormones. So the neuroendocrine cells, as a first step, secrete these releasing hormones. The releasing hormones go into the anterior pituitary. The cells there detect the releasing hormones and then secrete tropic hormones. So a two-step process. Neuroendocrine cells secrete releasing hormones. Releasing hormones go into the anterior pituitary and cause the secretion of tropic hormones. So the hypothalamus is really releasing these things locally. Sure, they're in the blood now, and so they circulate around, but they really just impact the anterior pituitary for our purposes. Well, then the question is, what triggers the hypothalamus? Well, the hypothalamus is part of the brain. So it is affected by hormone signals. We're about to go into feedback loops and see how hormone levels are regulated. And the hypothalamus is sensitive to hormone levels, so it doesn't keep on releasing hormones after hormone levels are sufficient. But it's made of neural tissue. It is also impacted by neural signals. So it can process neurally based information. And a lot of the stimuli that cause hormone release are environmental stimuli. Events out in the world that have to be detected and interpreted by the nervous system. So this is the interface between the nervous system and the endocrine system. External stimuli can still trigger hormone release. So some quick examples. We're not going to go into the details for all of these, but for example, there is a releasing hormone secreted by neuroendocrine cells in the hypothalamus called corticotropin releasing hormone. This goes into the anterior pituitary, and then the cells there secrete ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is a tropic hormone. That hormone goes to the adrenal cortex, which just sits on top of the kidney. And then that causes the kidney to secrete corticosteroids. So we have one hormone, a releasing hormone, secreted by the hypothalamus, causing the secretion of a tropic hormone by the anterior pituitary, which causes secretion of another hormone by the target organ, in this case, the adrenal glands. You can see this for the thyroid also. You may not have heard of the thyroid, but it's another organ of the body that secretes hormones. You do not need to know the acronyms or the particular names of these two things, but this is just an example. So the hypothalamus will secrete TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. That is a releasing hormone, has the word releasing in there. That goes to the anterior pituitary, which secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, which is a tropic hormone. That hormone goes to the thyroid and then secretes the thyroid hormones. Again, their names are not important, but the thyroid regulates things like metabolism and growth, very long-term processes. And that is just, again, one thing that the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus do. The example we'll focus on a bit more are the sex hormones, and these are a bit more complicated, both because there are two sexes and also because there are more hormones involved. But the hypothalamus secretes releasing hormones. We're not going to worry as much about one of these. We're really just going to worry about gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. That makes its way to the anterior pituitary gland, which secretes LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. Both sexes use these hormones, LH and FSH. They happen to be named because of their role in the female reproductive system, but males use these hormones also. They affect things like testosterone production and sperm production. We're about to see this. But these govern sexual development, reproductive cycles, sexual behavior, but we still see the same layout. We have a releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus, and a tropic hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary. And then we have the sex organs, the target organs themselves, that have their own hormones. And again, the targets are throughout the body. So the adrenal cortex sits on top of your kidneys. Obviously, the testes and the ovaries are below the abdomen. They are the sex organs. Thyroid, breast tissue, these are throughout the body. And the idea of feedback is very important here. So how do we control these hormone levels? Well, we use the concept of negative feedback. And all that really means is whatever the process does, whatever it produces, that product inhibits the process from occurring again. So you can have simple or complex versions of this, but in the case of hormone release, whatever the end target is, whatever that hormone is, the final hormone in that sequence will inhibit the secretion of the first hormone. You shut the loop down. And this keeps hormone levels from getting out of control. So you can have a simple loop. So the hypothalamus uses a releasing hormone that has a positive impact on the endocrine cells. In this case, we'll just say it's the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary secretes a tropic hormone that goes to some target cells. The target cells have some response. It could be a behavior. It could be their own hormone. But if we look at this biological response, it loops up back here to the right, and that has a negative impact on the hypothalamus. So if the target cells are sex organs, they release hormones of their own, and those hormones inhibit the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus stops secreting its releasing hormone, and that shuts the cycle down. It is negative feedback. The cycle regulates itself. So if there was a lot of sex hormone floating around, that would really inhibit the hypothalamus so that less sex hormone would be triggered. If there's not very much sex hormone floating around, well, nothing is inhibiting the hypothalamus. It will continue to stimulate the anterior pituitary until the level of sex hormone is appropriate. So that's a pretty simple negative feedback loop. The end product inhibits the first step in that process. With the anterior pituitary, it can get a little bit more complicated. We're sort of going to add an arm on that flow chart. The first few stages are very similar. You have the hypothalamus activating the anterior pituitary with a releasing hormone. The anterior pituitary activates other endocrine cells with a tropic hormone. Those other endocrine cells cause some other hormone release. But as we see here, there are 2 points of inhibition. That final hormone can inhibit the hypothalamus. It can also inhibit the anterior pituitary. So keep that in mind. Those points, there doesn't just have to be one point of inhibition. There can be multiple points of inhibition, and that will shut down multiple steps of this process. Okay, so we'll get specific, and these diagrams are about the sex hormones, how the sex hormones are regulated, what their effects are. And so for males, we'll start with males because they're simpler. We have the hypothalamus with its releasing hormones, secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone. That gets to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary secretes follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. And those 2 hormones make their way to the testes, the male sex organs. FSH has mainly the effect of producing sperm, the male gamete, obviously one of the important functions of the testes. The testes also produce testosterone, the male sex hormone. And this is what luteinizing hormone does in the male. And so we have these 2 different things that the testes do. Both are obviously important, and they're controlled by 2 different hormones. Now, if you look, you see this negative feedback process in both the male and the female. You see those minus signs at the top right of the diagram. And that is to say that the sex hormones produced by the gonads inhibit both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. I know these diagrams look complicated, especially the one on the right, and to be fair, they are. But we should recognize these components from the diagrams we've already seen before. So we see the hypothalamus, we see the anterior pituitary. We see this negative feedback portion coming back up and inhibiting the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So what we really want to focus on here are the specifics that deal with hormones in the gonads. So this part of the process is already familiar. Hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary secretes FSH and LH just as it does in males. And one of the reasons that the female cycle is more complex, its feedback system, is because of the menstrual cycle. And so FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, is named that because, and this is not going to be very helpful at first, it stimulates a follicle. It causes egg release. So a follicle contains an egg. When that follicle gets enough FSH, it builds up and it will release that egg. Luteinizing hormone causes that egg release and also causes what's sort of left over of the follicle to turn into what we call the corpus luteum. Okay, so we have the follicle, we have the egg, and we have the corpus luteum. The follicle secretes estrogens. As I mentioned before, estrogen is actually a group of chemicals. Estradiol is what most people mean when they say estrogen. But we'll stick with estrogens as a category. We're going to go into the individual members of that category. But the follicle releases estrogens. These are sex hormones. They have an inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, so that less FSH is released. And of course, estrogens are famous for promoting sexual development, just as testosterone promotes sexual development in the male. So you get those secondary and primary sexual characteristics. The sex organs develop. You have skeletal changes, the growth of the shoulders and overall height in men, height and the width of the hips in females. And so we have long-term development. But in terms of the menstrual cycle, you have these estrogens that inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, but they're also important for promoting the menstrual cycle. So as I mentioned, the corpus luteum is what's left over of the follicle after egg release. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone. So in the male, we just had testosterone being produced by the gonads. Here we have two different groups of hormones, the estrogens and the single hormone progesterone, which is secreted by the corpus luteum, and it gets the uterus ready for the implantation of an embryo if fertilization happens. What's interesting, though, is that if you follow this diagram, progesterone inhibits the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and that inhibits the release of luteinizing hormone. Well, the corpus luteum needs luteinizing hormone, needs LH, in order to survive. And without enough LH, the corpus luteum will degrade. And that will cause menstruation and the conclusion of the menstrual cycle. So the corpus luteum, by releasing progesterone, actually causes its own demise because it inhibits the release of hormones that it needs to maintain itself. Now, if pregnancy occurs, if implantation occurs, there are other parts of the reproductive system that sort of take over that role, and progesterone is maintained, but we don't have time to go into them. For now, it's just important to understand these cause and effect relationships. So we have a follicle that secretes estrogens, and is part of a negative feedback loop. We have the corpus luteum that secretes progesterone, and is part of its own negative feedback loop that actually leads to the degrading of the corpus luteum. And that's really the key of the menstrual cycle. You have components that are maintained by the very hormones that they inhibit. So that's why it's a little bit more complicated, but it's also why it's this interesting cause and effect negative feedback loop. So what do the estrogens do? Well, obviously they again, encourage sexual development, and they are important for the production of the corpus luteum and egg release. The corpus luteum releases progesterone, which thickens the walls of the uterus, and is also involved in maintaining pregnancy, and also getting ready for nursing behavior. So both short-term and long-term processes. And of course, these things affect not just levels of chemicals in the blood and the development of the body, they also have an impact on behavior. And here we'll see another kind of feedback loop. So here we have two pigeons. We have a female pigeon in a cage and a male pigeon that can see her. And so obviously that is a stimulus that the male pigeon's brain will process. It's a visual stimulus. He can see the female, but he needs to recognize that as a female of his species. Once he does, that signal gets sent to the hypothalamus. There's a potential mate. Now, the hypothalamus will secrete GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That causes the pituitary to secrete FSH and LH, which causes sperm production, but also testosterone production, and causes the male to engage in what are called bowing coos. You don't need to know that term, but it's when the pigeon will sort of tip its head over and over again and make these little sounds. And this is part of the mating behavior of the pigeon. So we have a visual stimulus. So we have sensory processing going on in the brain. We then have that signal being sent to the hypothalamus. And now we have the release of a hormone. So we've turned a neural signal into a hormone signal, an endocrine signal. Then the anterior pituitary secretes the two hormones we were just talking about, FSH and LH. This causes the release of testosterone by the testes. And then you have these courtship or mating behaviors. So you have the full loop. You have sensory stimulus that causes hormone release, which causes, eventually, behavior. And then if the female is receptive, if the female responds again, she can respond to that courtship behavior with courtship behavior of her own. Well, that's a new stimulus. And so you have a new stimulus process by the brain causing a new wave of hormone release. We're about to talk about sexual behavior more specifically, but that is how the nervous system, the endocrine system, and behavior all interact in this very particular case. And reproductive behavior can be broken down into a number of stages. So there's what's called sexual attraction, where each member of the couple, whatever two members of the species there are, first recognize that the other is a member of the opposite sex, that mating is possible, and then evaluates whether that is a desirable candidate. If the two individuals are mutually attracted, they move on to appetitive behavior that is meant to encourage reproduction. It is not copulation itself. This includes things like mating behavior, mating dances, vocalizations, certain behaviors that promote mating in both males and females. And of course we've seen the term appetitive behavior before in the context of drug seeking, and so that is applied here. These are behaviors intended to bring about a particular outcome, in this case reproduction. Then you have the actual reproductive act, copulation. And then there's post-copulatory behavior, and this varies widely. Copulation behavior varies widely, but so does post-copulatory behavior. Some species, after copulation is over, they part ways and there is no interaction thereafter. Others, as we've already seen for the prairie vole, form monogamous pairs. And so there is an extended relationship afterwards. Post-copulatory behavior can, of course, eventually involve parenting, but it could also, in the short term, involve an additional round of sexual attraction, appetitive behavior, and copulation. And when it comes to copulation, of course, as mammals, we exhibit what's called internal fertilization. So fertilization occurs within the female reproductive system, and not all animals use internal fertilization. Fish, insects, amphibians, they can use external fertilization. But we'll stick with internal fertilization because it's more applicable to human beings. Internal fertilization obviously requires the union of egg and sperm within the female reproductive system. But to get to that stage, the female has to be what we call sexually receptive. Most species, the reproductive act and the possibility of fertilization requires the active participation of the female. And in many animals and mammals, you have a mating season. You have a particular time period when females can be sexually receptive. Otherwise, they're not. This is often referred to as estrus, the time at which females are sexually receptive. And as this diagram shows, this often involves the release of estrogens and progesterone up to estrus. So this sort of triggers female reproductive behavior. And this is in this case, these are rats. But it also involves very specific behaviors. So if a female rat is sexually receptive, the release of these hormones can trigger what's called lordosis, which is this particular posture, this way of shaping the body to allow copulation and, by extension, fertilization. This depends heavily on hormone release. It certainly also depends heavily on neural processing, sensory stimuli like the presence of a male rat. In humans, this is not as hardwired. So we don't have estrus cycles in humans. We do not have mating seasons in humans. And stereotypic postures like this are not present in humans. But this is a simple example showing how powerful the combination of hormones and sensory stimuli can be. And then, of course, there's copulation itself, and this is followed by what's called the refractory phase. And this is another phrase that we've seen before in the context of action potentials. We have the refractory period, when the neuron is fired in action potential and cannot do so again for a little while. Similarly, members of a species will have a refractory phase where they will not engage in copulation again until a certain amount of time has passed. And that time period can vary widely from minutes to hours to days. And this is more often applied to males, that males have a certain period of time after orgasm that they cannot engage in copulation again. What's interesting is what's called the Coolidge effect. And this is where the refractory period, the refractory phase, is immensely shortened if a new sexual partner is presented. So it might take hours for the sexual behavior to be reinitiated with the same partner, but if it is a new partner, it greatly reduces that refractory phase, and now the male can engage in copulation again much more rapidly if it is a new partner. This has been well established in males. The presence of this effect in females, whether females will be sexually receptive sooner with a new partner, it's a bit, that evidence is a bit more controversial. It's a bit hazier. In case you're wondering why it's called the Coolidge effect, your book doesn't mention this. Older versions of your book mentioned this part, so I'll mention it here. It's named after former President Calvin Coolidge, who seems like an unlikely candidate to have a sexual behavior named after him. And it's named after an old joke that describes something Calvin Coolidge did that he probably never actually did. But Calvin Coolidge was notable for not saying much as president, being very quiet, being very reserved, and so this is called the Coolidge effect after this old joke, where Calvin Coolidge and the First Lady were touring a chicken farm, and they had a guide, the farmer, was showing them around, and Mrs. Coolidge was talking to the farmer, and noticed that the rooster was with the hens, and said, "Oh well, how often does the rooster mate?" And the farmer turns to her and says, "Well, several times a day, the rooster will engage in sexual behavior." Mrs. Coolidge says, "Oh, that's very interesting. Would you do me a favor and tell that to Mr. Coolidge?" The farmer says, "Okay." Goes over to Mr. Coolidge and says, "Mrs. Coolidge wanted me to mention to you that the rooster will engage in several rounds of sexual behavior in a single day." And Mr. Coolidge says, "Oh, that's very interesting. Is it always with the same hen?" The farmer says, "Oh, no, it's a different hen every time." And then Calvin Coolidge says, "Okay, well, tell that to Mrs. Coolidge." And so that's why it's called the Coolidge effect, the idea that the male will engage in more sexual behavior and that the refractory phase will be shorter if it's a new sexual partner that's presented. Again, in females, there is some evidence for this effect, but it is not as ironclad. And so this figure is from your book. This is a reprinting of a little article showing a guinea pig that made there's a male guinea pig that's made its way into a cage entirely composed of females and went missing. People didn't know where this male guinea pig was. And he was found in this cage with all of these female guinea pigs, and had apparently fathered 40 some odd offspring in those couple days that he was in there, but then was totally exhausted. He slept for 2 days afterwards. So it engaged in nothing but reproductive behavior during those couple days. But that's another illustration of the Coolidge effect. Obviously would not have engaged in that much reproductive behavior if only a single sexual partner were present. So that's the Coolidge effect. That's the refractory phase. And it's also important to highlight differences between human and non-human sexual behavior. And one thing that's different is that humans exhibit not only internal fertilization like other mammals, but also what we call concealed ovulation. So many mammals, it's obvious visually when a female is sexually receptive because there will be changes in coloration, for example, obvious changes in courtship behavior, very clear signals. In humans, these signals are less obvious. People don't change color based on where they are in the reproductive cycle, for example, or based on their level of sexual receptivity. And one idea for why this is it encourages long-term bonding, things like parental behavior. If you don't know when your mate is going to be sexually receptive and when fertilization can occur, it encourages you to stick around because you don't know which reproductive efforts will be successful. And when it comes to human sexual behavior, there has not been a lot of research done historically. Some of the earliest studies were done by an individual named Alfred Kinsey, who you may have heard of, but he had a hard time getting funding. He had a hard time getting permission to do the research. Even though sexual behavior is such an important component of human existence, this was often taboo for cultural, moral, religious reasons. And so he couldn't get very much support for his research. A little bit later, his work inspired the work of Masters and Johnson, who did even more research on how humans behave sexually, what their behaviors are like, how they develop sexually. Incidentally, both Kinsey's work and Masters and Johnson's work have been turned into movies and TV shows, Kinsey and Masters of Sex, respectively. And so this is a topic that's increasingly acceptable. We acknowledge that sexual behavior and sexual attraction, sexual interest is an important part of the human experience, and it is worth studying as much as other aspects of our psychology. And so not only has the scientific work been accepted, but even, as we can see here, creative work about that scientific work is now on the table, so to speak. So this is relatively new. We're talking about the last 60 years where this has been sort of grudgingly allowed. And one thing that has come out of this research is the difference in the female and male sexual responses. So the female response, there are more forms of the female sexual response. So we have, for example, there are female sexual responses that are characterized by excitement, what we call plateau, sexual stimulation, and then the attainment of orgasm. And this can happen once before resolution. It can happen multiple times before resolution, or orgasm might not happen at all. So there are multiple forms that the female sexual response can take. The males it tends to be more straightforward. There is the excitatory phase, plateau, orgasm, then resolution. And again, we have that refractory phase, after which the male will not engage in additional copulation for a little while. So the male response tends to be a bit more stereotyped. The female response is more varied and nuanced. And there are other differences between the sexes. Emotional and cognitive factors. Men tend to have higher sex drives, engage in sort of less discriminating sexual behavior. And these are, of course, just averages. This is not meant to characterize every male and every female. These are just looking at the data, the trends, so to speak. So, emotional factors play more into female sexuality. Women's sexuality tends to be a bit more fluid, for example, more changeable. And again, these are just trends, but there are some physiological and average psychological differences between men and women when it comes to sexual behavior. And going back to hormones, and specifically the gonadal hormones, so we know that the testes release testosterone. And by the way, females produce testosterone as well, and males produce estrogens. So we have the hormones in common. We're used to thinking of estrogen as a female hormone and testosterone as a male hormone. Both sexes produce both. And testosterone obviously has an impact on sexual behavior, but other behaviors as well. If we remember Berthold's experiment, reimplanting those testes caused not just sexual behavior and development, but also things like aggression and vocalization, behaviors not directly related to copulation. And Berthold did it by reimplanting the testes. That's a bit complicated. You can actually just inject testosterone and get this development back and get these behaviors back. Testosterone has what we call an activational effect. The presence of testosterone will cause this development and these behaviors. But we should be a little careful here. We know that testosterone is involved in aggressive behavior, but it is not as simple as testosterone will cause more sexual behavior and more aggression if you increase the level. That doesn't seem to be the case. What seems to be the case is that it takes a certain minimum amount of testosterone to cause sexual behavior, to cause aggression, and beyond that, it doesn't seem to really have an impact. So this is an experiment on the left from guinea pigs. And so they removed the testes of guinea pigs. Before they did that, they measured how much sexual activity they exhibited. And so there were guinea pigs that had a high sex drive, guinea pigs that had a medium sex drive, guinea pigs that had a low sex drive. They removed the testes and then artificially give them testosterone. They gave them either a little bit or a lot, a low dose or a high dose. And it turns out that those individual differences persisted. Guinea pigs that exhibited little sex drive before exhibited little sex drive afterwards. It didn't matter whether it was a low dose of testosterone or a high dose. They were back to their old selves, so to speak. High sex drive guinea pigs, a low dose of testosterone was sufficient for them to exhibit that high sex drive again. So we need to be a little careful when it comes to the idea that testosterone dosage is what's driving sexual behavior. Actually, just there's a certain minimum level that's required, and beyond that, we don't really know why there are individual differences. Okay, that will do it for our unit on hormones and sexual behavior. So we talked about the different types of hormones, both structurally, peptide, amine, steroid hormones, and functionally, releasing hormones, tropic hormones, gonadal hormones. And we talked about how these things are released. So we have neuroendocrine cells that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. We have the anterior pituitary that picks up releasing hormones and secretes new hormones into the bloodstream. And they're released in a global fashion. They circulate around the body and have an impact on a large number of tissues. We talked about those negative feedback cycles. So how we keep hormone levels from being too low, but also how do we avoid getting them too high? And it's because the hormones that are released by a process will also inhibit that process. And so if there's too little of the hormone around, you're not inhibiting that process. That process will sort of run free and cause the release of a lot more hormone. If there's a lot of the hormone around, it will inhibit the process. So you release very little or none at all. And we saw a link between the brain, hormones, and behavior. So we have, obviously, the nervous system that processes stimuli. We have hormones that circulate around the blood, affect tissues, and affect the brain. And we have behavior that responds to stimuli in the environment, behaviors that become more likely when certain hormones are around. And these things all interact. And we saw an example of sexual behavior that depends on neural processing, depends on hormone levels, and produces certain behaviors. Okay, so as always, take the online quiz for this lecture. And we're going to start a new unit next time on learning and memory. So be sure to do that reading. And we'll talk up front about the different types of learning and memory that there are. There are multiple types. We talk about memory or learning as sort of these monolithic ideas. But there are different forms of learning, and there are different forms of memory. Later on, we'll talk about how these relate to different neural processes, different parts of the brain even. Just as a reminder, don't forget about the writing assignments for the course. We're approaching the end of the course, and the writing assignments are an important part of your grade, so don't neglect those. So check the syllabus for requirements and deadlines, and keep that in mind as we get toward the end of the semester and final exam time. Okay, well that will do it for this lecture. See you next time.